All right, we continue talking about this subject. Professor Alex van der Heever holds a chair in the field of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at Wits School of Governance. He joins me now to talk about this. Professor van der Heever, good evening, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps to just give it some context. I know we're talking about the South African National State of the Nation address, but I'm just wondering, what are the socio-ecological mega trends of public governance and leadership in this current world order that we've seen? And has this coincided with attracting significant academic and policy reflection over the past few decades? Because as I mentioned, you're in this field of study.
So one of the problems or issues that are as important to South Africa is the establishment of coherent governance frameworks that ensure that, talking in sort of strategic terms, that the social contract can be implemented, and that is a connection between society and what government does, and that requires that you have structures that act in the public interest. And what we see in South Africa today is that there are a lot of problems at the leadership level in which the wrong people end up in positions of significant power and authority, and they abuse that power and authority and undermine the integrity of the state. And that has immense knock-on effects in almost every aspect of society. It means the coherence, the delivery of public goods and services is interfered with. And this is potentially one of the reasons why we are facing a multifaceted set of crises in South Africa. Our governance frameworks and the way in which they place people in positions of power are quite critical to delivery. And we are seeing the outcomes. The poor delivery is an indication that there's a problem there that we have to correct.
Because as I say, it's interesting for us to talk to you, but it doesn't occur in a vacuum. And I sometimes feel it comes down to members of the intelligence, such as yourself, being seen as talking heads. So I'm just wondering if these concepts that you interact with, is there any place for them? Does government listen to some of the concepts that you come up with in terms of contemporary governance?
Well, at a very sort of practical level, we teach it and engage with civil servants all the time. We run courses, talk it through, engage with it. And it's quite interesting to note that a lot of the civil servants that I interact with are, they're the future in South Africa. They're not necessarily in top positions now, but they are not necessarily part of the failures that we see. They are potentially part of the solutions. And we engage at an intellectual level as well as at a practical level on these issues. We have enormous gaps in our frameworks, in our legislative frameworks, in how we, for instance, at a practical level, create public entity governance arrangements around Eskom and state-owned enterprises. And that particular model creates the possibility of, for instance, corruption, state capture, etc., which has enormous implications, but we can close those gaps. And the same exists for the way we set up investigative authorities, the NPA, etc. So the way in which we organize key aspects of society and the state can have enormous impacts on delivery at the end of the day. And it's not an overnight process. But I think that we have a coherent constitution, but we haven't filled in lots of the gaps. And we're learning where those gaps are by what is failing. And the important thing is to learn from that faster than we fail. Learn from the failures and improve rather than go into a collapse because of those failures, because we fail to address them. And I'd say there is a risk that at this point in time, if we don't have a political will to close certain of these gaps, we could reach a critical juncture where we do become chronically degraded, the state and society and the governance framework. But I think we're far from there at this point.
And in this case, obviously, we are analyzing, looking at the State of the Nation address this year, but also past ones. Have they belied that over the years, generally regional governments have experienced a decline in the capacity for accountable and developmental governance, but also you have said our government doesn't seem to have the capacity to respond to society reversals. Have any of them been cognizant of these factors?
I don't think that there has been a sort of full recognition of the degree to which there has been systemic failure at the level of, let's say, provincial government and local government. The systemic failure can be diagnosed. And what at this point in time, I don't see the movement to correct the institutional weaknesses that result in these failures. So they're really allowed to get deep. And a knock-on effect, quite a simple one. For instance, municipalities that are corrupt, that blow all their money on irresponsibly, can't pay their Eskom bills, which creates a deficit at Eskom, which means Eskom can't be financially viable. That's kind of how these knock-on effects can work. We essentially need to address what is failing and understand what is failing at provincial government and get on with it. I'm not sure government has had the political will to take on the people who have been responsible for these failures, because many of the people responsible are still in positions of power and authority within these provinces. But there's significant evidence of what I would call a capability failure. In other words, the failure of leadership has degraded capability, which has actually reduced the ability of key areas of government to respond to complex problems. And by failing to respond to complex problems, the problems become more complex. And so they fall further and further behind. That's the state we're currently in.
And also, of course, when we talk about this, we take into context the internal and external shocks, but they've also given rise to a new form of politics that is shifting the relationships of power and redefining the parameters and mechanisms for accountability, like we've seen coalition governments. But unfortunately, they haven't played up to the hopes of better delivery of services. So what do you foresee, not only in what comes out of the 2023 State of the Nation address and the budget, but how that leads up to the 2024 general elections?
Well, one hope is that the current government and the actors in the state at the moment recognize the long-term faults in our electoral system that is impacting on the quality of our social contract. In other words, it's not connecting the people with the decisions that are made in government. A lot of the failures that we're seeing are simply because of that. The current coalition governments are the outcome of our existing electoral system, which has a lot of weaknesses and flaws in it, which essentially mean that we deal with political party bosses and structures that are to some degree disconnected from society. That's incredibly dangerous, and it also allows for corruption to continue. The penalties that society can impose on government are currently muted. And so that is corrected through the electoral system. So the current Electoral Act that is currently being slowed down by government needs to be reconsidered and basically redesigned, redefined in accordance with the Constitution, the Constitutional Court's requirements to actually reconnect with society. So we can't really have individual political parties sabotaging that process, whether it's the ANC or any other party that benefits from the current failures of the existing electoral system. Now, what we want from an electoral system is to be able to remove people who don't do their job and put in place people who can reasonably deliver. And that connection can be created through our electoral system. It's absolutely crucial for fundamental accountability in South Africa. Without that, almost all other systems struggle to take effect in South Africa. It's very difficult to make state institutions work if the politicians in positions of leadership can't be held accountable by society.
Just a quick and final question then, Professor van der Heever. What would anticipatory governance then look like? What would be the characteristics thereof to deal with the challenges that you paint and in line with the social compact?
So, well, I refer to a social contract rather than a social compact. The social contract is essentially the relationship between society and the rules that are made in society, whereas a social compact is a narrow structure. What you want out of a governance framework is not to fix structures through time. It basically allows for the participation of society and the changing of rules over time. And the rules in society need to constantly evolve. If there is a failure to evolve, then they fall behind the needs of society. There's no perfect structure. And the only way you do that is the only way you do that successfully and properly is by creating a framework that allows for inclusivity in the design of the rules of society. We don't have that. I would say that we exclude a lot of people from the processes of redesigning the rules. There's an appearance of consultation, but in fact, government and many government actors are in a strong position to ignore the public in many respects. It's why we don't see people prosecuted, why we see people maybe pushed aside, but we don't see any fundamental accountability where people blatantly steal money through the state structures or are completely disorganized and chaotic in how they carry on government.
Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your thoughts, Professor Alex van der Heever.